Welcome. This is our third weekly debrief video for Foundations of Business Strategy. We are approaching the halfway part of the course here. I'm excited to see that participation remains robust. We have over 400,000 video views and 140,000 post views. I continue to remain impressed by the level of discourse in the forums. Excited to see some of the conversations take place, and once again, just impressed by what I'm seeing on those forums. As I mentioned last week, I created a questions for professor subforum under general discussion, in which you can vote up the questions that you would like me to respond to each week. So in response to that, first, there were a number of questions about submitting case analyses. Now, to be clear, that is not required. You do not have to submit for a grade or for submission the case analyses. Those are there for you to hone your strategic analysis skills, to apply some of the tools in your toolkit, and to engage in some discussions about leading businesses and organizations. Now, some of you have asked, how can I get feedback on the analyses that I've conducted? And what I suggest is use the discussion forums to do that. Post your analyses and welcome feedback onto what you have put together for that week. There remain some questions about how to select firms for the final project, especially about questions about data availability, especially if you don't have privileged access to any particular company. What I would suggest, if you don't have privileged access, choose a large publicly traded company. Those companies often have a lot of information available online. You should be able to conduct the analysis for the final project, even if you don't have an insider access to those organizations, just using publicly available information available over the web. A number of you have asked if you can do analyses of your own firms, maybe entrepreneurial ventures, maybe larger firms you work with. Absolutely. Some have raised the question of businesses you're thinking of creating, an entrepreneurial venture. I would be fine with that as well. Just recognize some of the analyses, like a capability analysis, might be difficult to do when you're in these preliminary pre-formation steps of an organization. Now, some expressed concerns that you might be using proprietary information that you wouldn't like shared with a broader public audience. What I will point out here is, in order to receive the certificate of accomplishment for this course, you will need to get a peer assessment done of your analysis, which means at least 5 people, or no more than 5 people, will see your analysis at the end of the day through the peer assessment process. So if there is real sensitivity there, unfortunately you won't be able to engage in the peer assessment process. These won't be posted publicly, though, in a more general format. It will just be the peer assessment where there'll be access to them. Third, while there are some of you wondering where to get data and if data is available, others have raised this really interesting question about being overwhelmed by too much data. How do you make sense of the volumes of data that are often out there on companies, especially a company like Apple that we're discussing today? This is a really important point, and really there's no easy answer that I can give you to how to deal with this. What I would suggest is reread the introduction to the toolkit that was included in week 1. There they give some interesting opportunities for where you can collect data. I mentioned the first week, company websites, especially for publicly traded companies, are very useful. You often have a wealth of information about the company, including their financial reports. It's a great place to start, and then work your way from there. But it is a real skill that really can be developed over time as you do these types of strategic analyses of trying to hone in on the real relevant information and not get overwhelmed by just, once again, the pure volume of information that's available out there. Fourth, there's this question that some of you raised in the spirit of being overwhelmed by data. What do you do with a company that has multiple business units, multiple lines of business? It seems to complicate analysis. Well, one thing I would observe that in the last week of the course, we will explicitly consider multi-divisional businesses and what we often call corporate strategy, dealing with strategic situations across multiple business lines. For the purpose of your final project, you are welcome to choose one line of business for a particular organization that you're looking at. Let's say you're looking at General Electric. General Electric has many different businesses in many different industry segments. You can choose one of them, maybe their wind turbine business, as a focus for your analysis. Recognize that sometimes it's harder to get information at that subunit level, but it will be easier to do some of these analyses that we've discussed. Fifth, there was a question about the executive summary. Someone correctly observed that many consulting firms will just simply do kind of a bullet point list to be their executive summary, followed by a large slide deck of exhibits and analyses. I would like to ask you to consider and do prose for the final project of this report. I think it's a good exercise in trying to explicitly articulate your arguments that you're making, and it will make it much easier for the assessors, the peer assessors, your peers, to be able to make those assessments when looking at an actual written response rather than just a list of bullet points. But it is correct that that is often the way that these strategic analyses are presented, especially out of consulting firms. Finally, there were some questions about applying these concepts to nonprofits. Admittedly, the examples that I by and large have used have been pulled from the commercial sector, but I would argue that the tools and frameworks that we have discussed are applicable to the nonprofit sector. It's not often that we think about competition perhaps in the nonprofit sector in the same way, yet you are in competition as nonprofit players. You're in competition for donations, you're in competition for various customers or stakeholders that you're trying to appease and address and meet their concerns. And so I do think it is useful to think about these tools and apply them even in that context as well. All right, so now let's turn our attention to the case for the week, which is the Apple computer case. Apple is a company that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Personally, I'm a heavy user of their products. I have an iPod, I have an iPad, and in fact, my very first computer was an old Apple IIe. So I thought I'd share with you a picture of that. So here we have the old Apple IIe. This goes way back to the early 1980s here. Those two black things in between the keyboard and the monitor are disk drives, old floppy drives. The fact that you had two disk drives was because there was no internal hard drive within the computer. So to be able to run the operating system, you actually had to use a floppy disk in drive 1 to be the operating system. And then any applications or saving files would have to be done through floppy disk number 2 there. So this goes way back, though I would point out that I use a PC at work, and that's kind of an interesting question that is really central to the case discussion today. Now, the first question we ask is going back to last week's tool, the 5 forces analysis, and in particular doing a 5 forces analysis of the personal computer industry. Now, I suggested that you think of this in your traditional Windows-based PC and ask this question of how attractive is this industry. Now, you might remember from last week, I left you with this quote from Warren Buffett. Let me pull that up again. So the Buffett quote is, when an industry with a reputation for difficult economics meets a manager with a reputation for excellence, it is usually the industry that keeps its reputation intact. So the first question is really at the heart of it a question of, is this an industry with difficult economics? It's going to be an industry in which everyone struggles perhaps to do well in this segment. So very pleased to see the 5 forces analyses that you all had discussed on the forums here. There was some great discussions, some great debates. There was a nice thread started by Mohammed going back and forth on the degree to which smartphones are substitutes for desktops or laptops, some interesting debates on the potential barriers for entry into the industry. I would observe a lot of the differences and a lot of the arguments are really centered around how you actually draw the boundaries around this industry. Are we including in this analysis personal digital assistants or smartphones, or are we just limiting it to desktops and laptops? Clearly, there is no one right way to do this, but it's very important to be clear about the boundaries of the analysis you do, to be internally consistent once you define those boundaries. So let me share with you one potential way to think about the 5 forces here with respect to the PC industry. So the way I've defined the segment here is very narrowly as desktops and laptop computers in the PC segment, basically Wintel-based machines. And so what do you observe here? Well, one, I would argue there's actually relatively low barriers to entry, and probably most signaling of that in that segment is the offering of white box computers. These are off-label computers that are simply assembled together through various components and parts that are available on the market. In fact, leading companies like Dell got their start out of Michael Dell's college dorm room, where he just began assembling computers using, once again, parts that were available on the market there. Second interesting question is one about differentiation. Is there really much differentiation, once again, within the narrow Wintel-based PC architecture? And again, there could be debates either way, but when you look at pricing, when you look at even the profitability of companies who are assemblers in this industry, their Dells, the HPs, and the like, in this particular segment, it is a challenging environment. And one of the main reasons for that is really centering around supplier power. What you have here is a monopoly supplier in Windows and Microsoft, and more or less at Intel in the microprocessor segment, that gives them incredible bargaining power within the PC segment. So let me just give you some data here to kind of support this this idea that the real money to be made in the PC segment is upstream amongst the operating system and the microprocessor. So what you see here is a graph, what we refer to as a profit pool. A profit pool is a representation on one end of the net margins within the industry, and on the other side, the share of industry revenue here. So kind of, if you think about the price of a PC, what percent of it is going to the operating system versus the microprocessor. This is a simplified representation. We could break up PC assemblers and have other components like the motherboard and the casing and the like broke out here. But just for our purposes, let's keep it to these three main categories. What you find is the operating system here is about, if you look at Microsoft, $62 billion in sales, but it's 29% net margin, right? So a huge amount of the profits are going to Microsoft. Intel, about $43 billion in sales and an 18% net margin. So not quite as high as margin as Microsoft, but still a very, very healthy and robust profit margin for Intel. Now let's turn our attention to the assemblers, Dell, Hewlett-Packard, Acer. Now, HP is a little different because they're diversified into printers and other businesses, so it's a little hard to separate out the PC effect. Someone like Acer is a much more pure play within the industry. $17 billion in sales, 2.8% net margin. Dell, $52 billion in sales, 4.8% net margin. What you basically find is that the PC assemblers much shorter margins, much more difficult industry to compete in, and once again, in part, it's because you have these large, successful, almost monopolistic players upstream, Microsoft and Intel, that are driving that behavior. Now, we could discuss more of why that's the case, but in part, it's because the need for standardization within the PC segment. We've mentioned the idea of a network externality before, that the value of a product goes up as others begin to also adopt it. So in the Microsoft Intel case here, the Wintel case, that has become a dominant standard within the industry, and it gives them a very strong position within the market. All right, so given that, let's now turn to Apple. And is it the case that because this, once again, more narrowly defined PC market seems to be less attractive to the assemblers, is it also the case for Apple? So to begin with, let's consider their value chain and how their value chain is perhaps a little bit different than your standard PC assembler. So here's just a simple representation of their value chain. Now, the first thing we would observe is, unlike the PC assemblers, Apple is actually vertically integrated back into both the operating system and through partnerships to the chip manufacturers. Historically, Apple has actually had proprietary chips that they've worked with firms like Motorola and IBM. More recently, they've started to then adopt chips from Intel, very similar to the chips that you see, if not identical to the chips you see in a Microsoft-based PC. And as a result, you can now get Apples that then can also run the Microsoft operating system. But they still have, of course, their proprietary OS. In terms of assembly and design, obviously differences in product styling, in terms of the quality of the product. In terms of software, they rely both on self-development and third-party titles to provide their software portfolio. And then in terms of distribution, clearly a differentiated player spending heavily on marketing and branding. Their retail stores, being vertically integrated into retail stores, are the most successful on a revenue per square foot basis in any retail establishment. So all of this together, allows them to avoid some of the pain that the traditional PC manufacturers have, and it gets them to avoid this Wintel monopoly that Dell and others need to face. But there's some interesting questions about that. Chan observes, Apple has a sustainable competitive advantage, but in a niche personal computer market, basically because together its software is rare and hard to imitate. So it's a really interesting question about Apple, about, well, how lucrative is this niche position they have with the Mac in the PC segment? As the case mentions, and as you might be aware, the Mac is not a large market share part of the PC industry. It actually has been less than 10% through most of its history, and even low as 2 or 3% even in the last 10 years or so. So is this a valuable position or not for Apple to possess within this segment? So let me share with you a real simple, what I like to call back-of-the-envelope analysis here, and questioning whether that Apple might just be paying for its niche, buying its niche. So if we think about the cost to develop an OS, it's roughly $6 billion to do a new full-fledged release, like Windows 8 that just recently came out. The price per copy, roughly $50 per software for the operating system alone. Variable cost, one could argue in software, variable cost is near to zero, as you can imagine here. And that would be the cost per copy of the software sold. So it doesn't really cost much once you put the fixed cost investment of developing the OS there. So from that, we can calculate a break-even point, basically the number of copies they need to sell to be able to recoup the R&D costs to develop the operating system in the first place. So if there's $6 billion to develop an operating system, your margins are 50 minus 0, so it's about $50 per unit sold. You have to sell 120 million copies of the operating system to be able to recover your cost of investment. So let's look at Microsoft. Microsoft, once again, has a 92% share. There's roughly 300 million PCs sold per year, at least a couple years ago. That's 276 million copies per year of Microsoft's operating system sold. So you do the math, years to recoup, 120 million divided by 188 million, it's about 0.68 years, or about 33 weeks. So in other words, once Microsoft releases Windows 8, it will take them a little more than half a year to recoup that investment that they made in developing Windows 8. Sounds pretty good. Now let's look at Apple. Apple sold 16 million units in 2011. If we do the math, 120 million divided by 16 million, it's going to take them about 7.5 years to recoup that development cost for their operating system. And when you think about how frequently they come out with kind of a major release of their operating system, it's typically at a greater rate than every 7.5 years. So that doesn't look too good. Now, to be fair, there are some elements of this analysis that aren't fully reflected here. One, that the price of apples are more, so that years to recoup would come down if we think about the premium that Apple gets for its machines. Yet the point is still well taken, that having a small niche in this market, though attractive because it avoids some of the concerns with the five forces analysis, it might not be entirely lucrative given the fact that they only have such a small percentage of the overall market. Now, could they have more? Well, that's a really interesting question, but it's hard to see, given the standardization that's happened in the Wintel monopoly, whether they could do that in the narrowly defined kind of desktop and laptop market. But let's talk a little bit more about where those competitive advantages might come in. Okay, I really appreciated reading the debates about the capabilities of Apple and whether they're sustainable, where the competitive advantage comes from. Umesh, among others, talked about Apple's capacity for innovation, an obvious theme that Apple looks like they have a capacity for innovation that others do not. Fabio raises a really interesting question, one that a number of people have raised about, how important was Steve Jobs to all of this? Is he really a critical cog to making Apple successful? And now that he's gone, will Apple basically suffer in his absence? On a similar theme, Hedda talks about people, a theme from week one, that Apple has highly skilled employees as a real strength as Apple as they drive innovation. Though Hedda raises, I think, an important point here. However, there's increasing competition for skilled employees from firms such as Google, Facebook, etc. is a threat to Apple. So it revives this idea that while people are obviously important, there's also a market for those people, and that might make it very difficult for it to be a sustained competitive advantage as your competitors try to capture what you have. This all relates to really the ultimate question, which is our last question. And what do you recommend Apple do with its core computer business, the Mac? Lots of interesting ideas advanced about how the PC will evolve, including whether we'll even see laptops and desktops in the future. I unfortunately don't have a crystal ball on this. One that knows that technologies tend to evolve in ways that we don't foresee well. So we have to keep that in mind. But it's interesting, to put this in a historical context. Karthik has a nice observation on the discussion boards that Steve Jobs revived the company not by trying to sell more Macs, but by creating new products. And just to highlight that, let me just share with you some data here on Apple's stock price, and you can think of it as market capitalization as well over the years. So here we have Apple's stock price from 1981 to 2004. And what you see here is the black line is Apple's stock appreciation, and then in the orangish line here is the NASDAQ over this same time period. So first, the NASDAQ clearly outperforming Apple over this 20-year plus period. And in fact, if you look here, is 0% return. An investment in Apple back all the way in 1981 had a return of almost 0% by 2003. Not a great investment, as you can imagine. And I'll point out that Steve Jobs returned to Apple back in 1997, right about here. So we have this bump here around the dot-com boom where Apple saw some stock price appreciation, but then they returned back here to this very low level after that. So it was 7 years into Steve Jobs' return to Apple, and Apple was struggling and really not doing well. And I've mentioned in other videos, Michael Dell commenting that Apple just needs to go out of business and go away. Well, what happened? Well, first, let me observe here. Here's Dell's stock price during the same time period. So maybe understandable where Michael Dell is coming from. Now, partly the percentages are so extreme here for Dell because they were coming from basically nothing during this period to where they are. But clearly, Dell, a very different business model, one focused on direct sales, customized machines, a very low-cost strategy, did very, very well during this period where, once again, Apple really struggled. But then, of course, things changed for Apple. Starting in 2004, release of the iPod. Eventually, the iPod is made available for the PC, which really is the part where it starts to take off. They then have a succession of hits with the iPhone and now the iPad. And now they have grown to be the largest market capitalized firm in the world here, with a continue to increase stock price here. So a massive success story over the last 10 years or so. With Apple that we're all aware of. But to Karthik's point, if we look here at their actual revenues and where they're coming from, what you see is a transformation of the company. If we go back in 2002, and I know it's difficult to read, I'll make these slides available. We see 4.5 billion in sales coming almost all from the Mac back in 2002. Then, starting in 2003, we start to see iPods become more significant. And by 2006, iPods finally overtake Mac in terms of the largest sales for the organization. Now, as time continues to go forward, they offer the iPhone and the iPad, and it leaves us to where we are today, where at 21 billion in sales for the Mac, it is, let's see here, about a fifth of their total revenues, then, of their total sales, with the iPhone and the iPad making up significant portions now of their revenue stream. So this point again that Apple transformed themselves not by selling more Macs, but really at the end of the day being able to find these other product categories that they were able to exploit and do very well. So that gets us, and to highlight this one last little graph here. Here we have OS market share as of Q3 of 2011, and what you see, the blue here on desktops and laptops is Windows. Macintosh is only about 7% of the market during this time period. Compare that to mobile and tablets. The iOS, this is Apple here, is 61% of the market compared to Android and some of these others. So again, Apple has done incredibly well in mobile and tablets with the iPhone and the iPad, but in desktops and laptops, they're still really just a niche player at the end of the day. So it goes back to our question here, what should you do with it? What do we do with this Macintosh product line at this point, especially if my analysis is correct that it's not an incredibly lucrative position given the upfront costs they have to incur to maintain their own operating system? Well, I'm not going to provide the answer. I don't know the answer to this. It is interesting to me that Apple was being left for dead by many 10 years ago and is now one of the largest, most successful companies in the world. What it tells you is a lot can change in 10 years. So where will we be 10 years from now with Apple? As others have mentioned, it's going to be interesting to see how the PC market evolves. What happens with laptops and desktops? What plays does Apple make? It does seem that there's an opportunity now. There's an opportunity to break the Wintel monopoly that's existed for going on 30 years in the PC market. Clearly there's a battle brewing, as many have pointed out, between Google with their Android platform, Microsoft with continuing player in this industry, and Apple. Next week, we're going to talk more explicitly about the dynamics of strategy and this idea of competitive life cycle. So this will come up again and hopefully provide us a little more tools and understanding about how we can think about how these industries may evolve over time. All right, let me end today by just encouraging you to keep up with the course material. As always, we'll be releasing the 4th week of materials on Sunday evening. I encourage you again to keep participating in the forums, and if you have not done so yet, begin to work on that final project, start applying the tools that we've learned so far. All right, enjoy the week, and can't wait to see and talk to you next week. Take care.